What's going on, guys? I'm Brooks from Big Number One, and you know this place, you know myself. Probably don't know the bike though. You probably do. You've probably seen the rumblings of it out there and all the questions that are in place. I'm going to touch on and try to shed some light on what, where, and why is the BMW R18. Come and check it out. All right, guys, we'll kind of start and just go back explaining a few things here and there. This bike is kind of classified as a cruiser, right? That is what BMW said it was going to be and everything else. But if you see some of the guys that have ridden it, some of the reviews, the vlogs out there, or ridden it yourself, you'll see that this is more of like a sport tour at heart, even though it doesn't look like it. It's like an old 1936 R5. And for the most part it is. And I'm going to touch on that down the way. But right up front, you get a good example of this. The only bike really in this class that has dual discs up front, the Harley Softail in this class. Single disc. Now, that is BMW, that's what they do. They do everything with a little bit of pizzazz, a little bit of, you know, flair is a German thing, you know. But they always make everything efficient, make everything work right, you know. LED light up here. They're only designed after anything, but most cruisers don't even have LED lights right now. Just go to the very, very top in the Indians and the Harleys, the big baggers and everything else. They have now just gotten to it in the last couple of years. LEDs all the way around, which this bike has. I'll show you as we go back. Blinkers are all LEDs. LEDs are light, efficient, and they're bright. Now the heart of this little beast here, obviously, 1802cc, big boy boxing. Now, I said earlier why. Well, one, because they can, and they did, but it's different. BMW has always done things a little bit differently. Now the Boxer has very much been their staple, but the why truly, if you look back to a 36 R5 like I mentioned before, that was obviously a flat twin. That was kind of like the thing then. That was the first into it. That R5 had so much of the industry's first that are done still to the same to this day as literally every other bike that's pretty much out there. Front suspension on this thing, telescopic fork. It is not a BMW staple, telelift. Back in 36, this R5 was the very first, arguably, but it really was, front suspension that had a oil damping hydraulic anyway. Telescopic fork, first one. That's pretty rad. That's why they went with this. Model it very much after the R5. BMW just has the technology to make that work as well, or not as well as they want to. And for this one, especially being a low seat like I'm sitting here, it uses what's available very, very, very well. Motor doesn't really rev high, doesn't have to. It's 1802 cc's. Gobs of grunt. BMW rates of 116. I'm seeing 103 on a dyno. It's not losing very much through a shaft drive. That's pretty impressive. It's not a winder, it's a cranker. And this thing shakes when you crank it. It's like an old school Chevrolet with shaker hood or something like that back in the day. This one's really, really rad. Mentioned up front. Steering damper. How many cruisers do you know that has a steering damper? How many do you know that have the need for a steering damper? Not many. It goes back to what I was saying earlier about the sport tour heart of this bike, because it's there. It's pretty grunty and sporty and all those good things. But the cruiser thing I was talking about earlier looks like an old rigid frame, like the 36 and 37 R5. Well, they made that one for 2 years. Oddly enough, the very next year they went with a soft tail suspension on the R5, and technically the design mold for this was only made for 2 years. Only sold 2,700 units, give or take. But it made an impact on the entire market. Still, right now, 30 or 40 of them are sitting right here. But the heart, this is the bike I'm sitting on. The history and everybody else is kind of going, why or what? I don't see the history here. What does that mean? If you go back and check it out, this whole bike was purpose built exactly how they wanted to try to attack the American market, obviously. But they had everything in place already. All they had to do was redo what they've been doing since 1936. Is that insane? It's pretty insane. I love it. I'm a big fan of this bike after doing some research, because I was a naysayer to begin with as well. It's good. The tank is the same dimensions and everything else as the old 36 bike. Identical. The fob looks just like the tank. You do your research, check out. BMW was very, very, very well known for their tanks. They were always pieces of art. They were still a piece of a motorcycle. Most people will be a motor base or something like that. This has everything. And if you look at it from where I'm sitting, it's really cool too. Let me show you. Now this shot might be a little awkward, camera angles and everything else, but I want to show you the sight line down this bike. It is, like I said, it's almost identical to the old bike, and that's not a bad thing. That thing was, like I said earlier, it's a work of art that is still, to this day, very, very widely viewed or even spoke about as the most beautiful bike ever made. Now, it was back then. It's still, to this day, talked about like that. And they modeled this whole bike after that, to the shape of the tank, just right up through there. And like I mentioned earlier, the key fob is the exact same design, look, and everything else because of what that thing meant then and still now. Little bitty things like the cap was identical. The ridges, everything else, no key, having to get out of it. But the old bike had the gauge was actually part of the headlight itself. Now, obviously, you need a bit of room in here to do what we need to do. The gauges do way more than they used to. A little rolly odometer than the old ones. But you've got technology, traction control, things like that. And this thing needs to tell you what to do. So it needs more stuff. But they still have the same look. If you're on the bike looking down, it looks like this is a part of that. It's very, very sharp. On the back side here, a little ECU right there. Hide it. Keep it in the wind though. Keep it cool. So this bike, which has no problems being a huge motor out here with cooling whatsoever. I've ridden it myself quite a few miles. You just don't really get anything. Old school BMWs seem like they were hot. Seems like the bigger they make them, the colder they run. It's kind of crazy. Everybody's asking, what does traction control do for a cruiser? Ask an Indian Challenger owner. They're groovy. Now this button right here turns it all off. Because what is the point in having an 1802cc big twin if you can't do a burnout from time to time? Yeah. Sport still. There's a couple things I wanted to catch on the engine down here. You know, the older bike, like I've been harping on the entire time, was a dual push rod. Right dead on top of the engine, just like this. A little poke out there, part of that design, well known. Same kind of thing. And the old cases used to be what they called a tunnel case. Seamless. It was one piece. Instead of split cases like they used to be back in the day, which is much more efficient when you're talking about gaskets and seals and everything else and things you might have to fix down the way. Now this isn't exactly that. They did try to make it that. Oddly enough, especially this here, this is just a cover. If you do decide you want to replace this, obviously a boxer engine, the first thing that hits the ground when it falls over is the head. It's just a cover. You put nice guarded covers like you can on the GS's, but you don't have to drain any oil or do anything else because those two bolts pop right off. Everything is still encased right there, and you can do whatever you want to do with it. Ugly, pretty, shiny, dull. You don't have to be a professional either, or change fluids, which is awesome. Speaking of fluids, I didn't touch on this on the other, but the clutch is hydraulic. Reservoirs are up there, tight, aluminum, sealed, out of the way. Don't have anything hanging off the bike, make everything nice and smooth and sleek like this bike is, and the old bike was. Even the rear reservoir, you've seen a lot of those. Little plastic cup about yay big, just out of the way of your right foot, you might hit it. Tucked down here, nice and sleek and clean, but side glass, all the functionality that you would think BMWs have, it's all here, but it looks as minimalistic as possible because that was the whole thing with the old bike. Minimalist, but full. I wanted to touch on a couple things that I was reading a lot of comments, and I don't know, just negative feedback, I guess, if you want to put it that way. One of the main points was the exhaust on this machine. If you look at the old bike, they were shaped the same way. They just had to do less stuff inside the exhaust than they have to do nowadays. Euro 5 is very, very intrusive when it comes to, performance and everything else. They have to have X amount of this, that, or the other. Everything's getting more demanding. So you got to make stuff a little bit bigger. And it still fits with the flow. It's nice and tucked in. It's not all out and in the way, just like the brakes I just mentioned. But the fins, seemed to be, I don't know, the main topic of scrutiny, if you will. But the bike was that way then. It works. If you really look at it as a whole, all this works. It's very, very good design. Might not be what we're used to from BMW. And that is not a bad thing. A company like BMW sets their money and their mind to anything, you usually get some successes. Might not be what is outwardly available or obvious. Like I said, sport tour bike, really, the way this thing rides and feels, looks like a cruiser. Well, it happens. Going back to the old bike again, this drive shaft is polished, and that's freaking rad. I love the look of this, sticking with everything else. It flows with the exhaust. Actually does. The old bike had the exposed one. They spit shine this bad boy out to a nice sheen, and it looks sharp. And yes, you can see it when you're going down the road. Adds to some of that minimalistic thing I keep touching on. But one thing that the bike of old didn't have, rear suspension. I know I touched on this earlier, but still, it was a rigid frame, a truly rigid frame. It's designed to look like that. I know that's not a new idea. I've been doing the soft tail like that for years. But it looks cool. It just does. If you've got a nice suspension back here, shy of 4 inches of travel, which seems to be about market standard right now if you look at Yamaha, Indy, and everybody else, that's what can you do with it? They decided to make this bike a little bit more feel, not so much relax, cruise, sporty. Cantilever rear suspension, looking like a rigid tail. That's just sharp, man, and it works very, very well. Another complaint I kept reading about was weight. This bike is heavy. I mean, yeah, it's heavy for the class, but you have things in place for that. You have a big engine that'll help you forward. What helps you backward is right here, a little reverse lever. It's just like the older bike. It was on the right side of that bike. It was a neutral finder, as they called it. This right there, reverse. If it's heavy, big deal. The bike will help you. That's the whole point. It's got you all the way through. And I got you if you want to put one of these in your driveway. Come see Brooks, big #1 Motorsports. It's an R18, man. 2021. 36 R5.